Now, if we're telling you that these animals require 75% humidity, and you're doing that with a squirt bottle, then you are going to be spraying, say you're in Minnesota and your ambient humidity is 40%, and you're trying to maintain 75%. You're going to be squirting the crap out of that thing, right? And so these animals require high humidity, but the caveat to that is the enclosure cannot be wet. Wet enclosures kill.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gecko Cove Connection. My name is Bobby, and today I'm introducing the man who doesn't need an introduction, the one, the only, Paul from RhacHouse. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good to be here.
I thank you for coming on. Honestly, you're one of the biggest names in gargoyle geckos. I met you at Tinley. You had one of the biggest tables with the largest selection of gargoyles. To me, when I think of someone who specializes only in gargoyles, you're the first name that comes up.
Thank you.
I really am excited to be interviewing you. I know that you've got some pearls of wisdom that you're going to lay on us today, and I'm like a kid in a candy store right now. I'm just ready to jump right in. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah. So let's instead of just asking you your full backstory, let me ask you this first. Why gargoyles? Out of all the new cal species, out of all the animals you could have worked with, because you started a lot earlier when they weren't as popular, what drew you to gargoyles?
Well, at my introduction of the new Caledonian species is when I was working for Sandfire. Back then, Alan Rapace and Bob Mayu were partners, so that my introduction was through Alan. And of course, even then, the cresteds were the mainstay. I've never been one to kind of follow. I kind of do my own thing. When I first met Alan, honestly, it was a photograph that I had seen. I don't remember who had taken it, but it was a gargoyle gecko. It was fired down. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant, but it was fired down, so it was completely white, but the eyes were blue, baby blue. So this was a white-looking gecko with blue eyes, and that one picture is what sparked it all. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I had to have one. And once I realized what it was, and the care and a lot of the aspects were the same as the crested gecko, and I started taking care of them. To me, it was just a much, much better gecko for everything that I was looking for.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, the blue eyes with, and the black and whites aren't as popular as I think they should be or could be. And I think that talking to some people who are always looking for new geckos, I'm seeing the interest peak up in black and whites. So it's cool that was kind of your introduction. How often do you get, especially with talking about fired up and fired down, when people are at your table? Oh, do these geckos change colors like chameleons? Do you get that question a lot? Because I feel like I do.
In the beginning, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think quite so much now. I think maybe it's because the crested gecko market, maybe it's the gargoyle. I don't know, but I think the understanding of firing up and firing down has come a long way in the last couple of years. Now, do I still get that on occasion, especially at the shows? Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely.
No, it's a fun question, but I agree. With the popularity, more people understand firing up and firing down, which is, makes our jobs a little bit easier.
What I see in that, I think the one thing that people don't quite understand is maybe the reasoning as to why. I still do see a lot of people. I like
that question.
A lot of people still seem to think along the same lines as a chameleon that, that firing up and down is an attitude or, anger or comfort. And I'm not saying that those things do have an influence, but the main reason is blending in or thermal regulation. If they're cold, they're going to be darker. If they're warm, they're going to be lighter. That kind of thing.
So is that why, when I invented my very first show I guess it was a little over a month ago at Schaumburg, and I had put covers over my animals to try to keep them more fired up. So what you're saying is the reason for that is because they want to kind of blend in with the darker environment.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Remember New Caledonia, the geckos, the largest biomass on the island. All the geckos are eating other geckos to some degree. Even crested geckos are eating other geckos, no doubt. So, when they're in that dark background, blending in is it's a primary defense.
It makes sense. I mean, just knowing nature as I do, even like you think of like the evolution of why sharks, a lot of them are darker above and, darker on one side, lighter on the other. It's to blend in with the sunlight versus the deep. So it makes sense with the geckos that they have that ability, which is pretty cool. Speaking of geckos eating geckos, kind of jumping into diet, we don't utilize geckos for feeders. A lot of us, some do. I've heard. What's your take on, especially gargoyles? You look at their cone teeth; they are predators, and 100%. So knowing the protein requirements, the calcium requirements, do you think we're doing enough with the current diets to suffice with protein?
No, not at all.
No.
Okay. I've done experiments that, in my opinion, at least in my collection, they prove that. Although that's not, it sounds simple. Change the diet, put more protein in the diet. It is not that simple, unfortunately. I wish it were, because I think we'd have much better results. I think really good evidence for that idea.
Sure.
Is the fact that we've seen parthenogenesis, successful parthenogenesis in almost all the New Caledonian geckos, with the exception of gargoyles. There's been a handful of instances, but by and far, parthenogenesis does not work. Okay. All right, in captivity. In one group of animals that I had 2 seasons ago, for this one particular group, we bumped up the calcium and protein intake on that entire group substantially. And the results that I saw told me exactly what I thought I was going to see. These were unbred. These were not bred animals. These were between 2 and 3 years old. Most of them were females. They're sexually mature, so they are ovulating, but they have not been bred. So, they're not reproducing per se.
Sure.
In past seasons, in this group of animals that I hold back, I would typically see the beginning of the season comes through, and a handful of them would cycle, and they might lay eggs, 1 or 2 clutches. Very rarely would they look viable. They look nice, but very rarely would they have a Cheerio in them or anything like that. The year that I bumped up the protein substantially, all of those animals started ovulating on a monthly basis, even though they weren't bred. And the number of eggs that came out of them now I don't save the partho eggs anymore, just because
there's no hatch
statistically it doesn't make sense just yet.
Sure.
But out of that group, those animals laid monthly. That tells me egg production is directly tied to protein. I think if we were able to up the protein in these animals, we would start to see successful parthenogenesis. We'd probably start to see a lot of things that we're not seeing right now. Okay.
So how would you recommend supplementing your gargoyles with extra protein? Are we going to go and get, organic whey protein and add it to the diet? No. Is it more bugs? Is it...
Yeah, it's got to be animal protein. Animal protein and plant proteins, while some of them can be very similar, they are not. You can't feed a lion whey protein and expect it to live, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They are different proteins. Now, if I'm correct, and a lot of the studies have kind of pointed in that direction, gargoyles are primarily eating other geckos. You look at their build, you look at their tooth structure, you look at the skull structure. All of those things point in that direction. If they are in fact eating other geckos for the vast majority of their diet throughout the year, then that means that the protein and calcium requirements are, in my opinion, substantially higher than we're providing in captivity.
Absolutely. Now, okay, so they're eating other geckos, and the protein that comes from animal protein. Is there a difference between? And I don't know if you know this, but is there a difference between feeding them, like pinky mice or small fuzzies that are size appropriate with mammalian, protein versus other reptiles? Is there any research on that you know of, or any downside?
I don't know of any research. I don't typically do pinkies myself.
Okay.
I have done them in the past for animals that are in need. I don't do it on a regular basis. As far as the protein goes, I think that's spot on. It's still an animal protein. I think the protein is right. The only problem that I would see in pinkies is the fat.
Yep, that's what I think.
If they're eating other geckos, we're not talking about fat. Most geckos are not fat.
Right. They're usually on the thin side.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
pinkies would definitely be a good protein source. The only thing, like I said, I would worry about doing it regularly is the fat content.
Yeah. I was even thinking, if again, they like the motion. They like, some of them you can get to tongue feed a little bit easier than others. But I wonder if anybody has ever used like Reptilinks or anything like that for their gargoyles, just with a higher protein base. So just something I was looking at. I think I got an advertisement on social media for Reptilinks, and oh, maybe
if it's something that they would consume. I mean, perhaps, although to be honest with you, I think it might be a little bit difficult to get them to take something like that. I think it would be as difficult as it is to get most of them to eat bugs.
Right.
Because that's not what they're programmed for. They're programmed for geckos.
Yeah. And so I guess that's another question. Do you feed bugs, and how do you get your geckos on bugs? Because I find certain gargoyles are just, once they hit that adolescent stage, anything that moves, they'll just pounce on, and they're great. I love those geckos because they grow really nicely. Other geckos will not touch it to save their life. I can put a dish out. I can try to tongue feed. I can rip off the head of the cricket and try to do all the tricks I've heard. The only thing that actually works pretty well is dusting with Pangea. I got that recommendation. That seemed to work pretty well, just because they're so used to the Rapashi Pangea stuff. But what are your tricks?
The two that I use, cutting the head off.
Yep.
And dabbing the juice onto their nose. If that method doesn't work, then blending bugs directly into the diet.
Yep.
The cutting the head off, for me, that works 99% of the time. Maybe not always the first time, right? I mean, because sometimes you might have to go through that process several times in order to get the animal to take it. But does that teach them to take bugs? The vast majority of the time it does. The people that I've talked to that have tried it, when it doesn't work, a lot of times what I think is happening is I think a lot of people want these animals to eat a lot more than they actually do, than they would naturally eat, right? So what I tell people, if you're trying to teach them to take bugs, hold back the diet. Don't offer diet for 3 or 4 days, right? Now the gecko is hungry. And when you go to put that cricket in front of him with a hungry belly, he's much more likely to take it. I do the tongue feeding 2 or 3 times. Once they take it like that, then I can throw the cricket in and let them chase it down, and it usually works.
Yeah, because they learn. They do learn, that tongs made food, which is, just they're smarter than we give them credit for.
Oh my goodness! I've got some stories that would really, some things that I've seen at the shows.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, just the behaviors and interactions between the animals and people. We underestimate. I mean, even still to this day, I mean, I give these guys a lot of credit, and every once in a while they do something that kind of really throws me for a loop and makes me think twice.
You got a good story?
All right. So I was just doing this show in New York. This is when I still lived up north. And, my tables would routinely get 4 or 5 people deep, and it's stacked. And all day long, this is a Saturday or Sunday show, I don't recall. But all day long, this group of young girls, I don't know, between 7, maybe 12, were coming over to the table and playing. You've been to my table. You know I've got all the adults out for display, right, that people can touch. So these little girls were coming up to the table, and they were playing with the Gargs, with my displays. And two of the girls in particular, two older girls, were not being quite as respectful to the animals as maybe they should. But they're little kids, right? When this happens at my table, I tend to let it go as long as the animals are putting up with it, because this is how I teach the animals to trust people. So the animals were putting up with it. They're troopers, man. They actually like the interaction. So they've learned over the years, they put up with quite a bit. So throughout the day, these girls would come up and play with the animals for 15 minutes, whatever, and then leave. They probably did this 20, 25 times during the day. So at the end of the day, when the place is clearing out, my table's empty. All my animals are sitting out on the displays. These girls were on the other side of the building. They saw my table was empty and started running down the aisle straight toward my table, screaming and giggling like little girls do. This is what caught my attention, right? The second that I looked up at these little girls, every single one of my animals left the front of the table. Not one, not two. I typically have 7 of them out there. All 7 left the front of the table and came toward me. So without a doubt, they recognized those girls from all the way across the building, from everybody else that was in the show at the time. They knew it was going to happen, and they decided that they had had enough of those little girls already.
Yeah.
So just think about the awareness and the understanding that has to happen in order for the animals to react that way. They know individuals. They are when we're at the shows, these animals are paying attention to everything that's going on, and they are understanding everything that's going on to a certain degree.
That is so cool. Yeah, I mean, I think we underestimate a lot of animals, but just working with my gargoyles, they all have different personalities. I can tell you which one I trust with my 5-year-old, which one I trust so much I would, let my 3-year-old, handle. I train my 5 and 3-year-old as well to handle them. So it's training on both ends. But they all are so different. And even the babies, my baby rack, right out of the egg, some of them are just feisty and defensive. And then other ones are just super chill. I actually just got one today. I picked it up, a beautiful, hopefully it stays female, from J Reptile. And to me, this reminds me of my girl Bimini, who's my chillest gecko. And it just, usually after shipping, they're a little bit like, leave me alone, right? And they want to get out of there. I took that lid off, and she wouldn't move. She was just like, I'm good. And I picked her up, and she just sat there on my hand. She was great, and I was like, you could, a little bit with nature, nurture. Maybe it's part of the genetics. I think breeding chill geckos together, you'll get more chill babies. That's just my theory.
Everything is genetic.
Right. It's why, when we all complain about being our parents, and by the time you're 35, 40 plus, you start doing things like, damn it, I didn't want to act like my dad.
The harder you try not to, it seems like the more you do.
Right, exactly. So, but yeah, no, I think there's definitely some, some fireworks going off behind those eyes, those beautiful gargoyle eyes. So, speaking of genetics, I went and before this interview, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I watched your interview again with Tiki's. I loved that interview. I've probably watched it way too many times, so half the viewership is probably just me. But I loved it. It was a lot of great information. And one of the things that came up that I've talked to other people about who subscribe to this as well is the male maker theory.
Oh yeah.
So I want to chat with you a little bit about male makers. Do you still believe in the theory?
I do.
And the biggest question that I have with it that I need to have a follow-up is, do male makers make male makers? Because that, I think, is huge if that's the case.
Yes, sir. Now, when I can only go by percentages, right? So when we first identified the male makers, I use groups. I breed in groups. So I've got one male with 5 females in most of my groups. So I've got this male maker with 5 females. I get almost 100% male offspring out of this group from 5 females. I average 10 babies a year from a female. So you're looking at 50 babies in 1 year that are predominantly male. Obviously, I can't hold back all of those and test every single one.
No.
But we did hold back a good number of them. And of the ones that were held back and then raised and then bred again, are they 100% male makers like Dad? No, not all of them. But were all the animals that were held back and then bred again, were they what I would call male makers? Mm-hmm. Yes. And from if what I saw in my collection in the first 10 years of keeping them, and what I think is happening in the wild, I think the species is naturally a female heavy species. They're an apex predator on an island. They're living 30 plus years. They're capable of parthenogenesis. As far as we know right now, the gargoyles are really predominantly only found on the lower 2/3 of the island, although that probably is not the case. But as far as we know now,
they move.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, that set of parameters, it doesn't take a whole lot of males to keep that particular species going for the long haul. So I don't see, in the first couple of years, I had, out of 300 animals I'd hold back to raise them up till I could sex them positively, I had less than 2% male. So I think that is what the species naturally is. Now, when we started do getting males, and as time goes on, we're not aware of this fact. And of course, in the first 2 decades, males were the cream of the crop. I mean, that was what you wanted because they were so dang hard to come across. Now, what I see, there's more males available now. I'm producing more males than I've ever produced. When you go online and some of the forums, it's funny because now this is over years, right, that I've seen this.
Sure.
You'll see conversations where somebody will say, well, I went to my local expo and I couldn't find a male. And then somebody else will chime in and say, wow, that's strange. I went to my expo and all I can see are males. There's nothing else regional there. And I think that's why. I think because there are male producers. We don't quite understand that as a whole yet. So there are some people in some places that are producing tons and tons of males, and there are some in other places that are not.
Yeah. And I think, even just talking to individual breeders, right? You talk to the breeder A and they only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 males. So we're talking smaller breeders, right? Mm-hmm. But they're producing, they're breeding them to a bunch of females, and they need more females. So they have to go out and buy females, where you got, the next breeder I talked to, like you said, even if it's not regional, it's just, they're only producing females. Mm-hmm. So I think, yes, people are running into it. Even my first season, now this is only my second year breeding, and I only had 13 eggs last year, so nothing major. But within those eggs, from what I've talked to the people I've had grow up my babies, and the ones I held back, anything that came from my boy Raffles turned out to be male, almost 100%. And so I was like, I after listening about male makers, I'm like, I ended up selling him. He's gorgeous and they produced some great babies, but I was like, I don't think I can keep that many males. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to hold back some babies just getting started, and I'd rather hold back some females. So we'll see if my other males I picked up are male makers, or if they're now there are male makers, but then are there female makers, and are there 50-50 or mixed makers?
Sure. I think if you want to go down,
we lean towards female.
Yeah, I think the standard would be female makers, right?
Sure.
Well, actually, you know what? That's probably a misstatement too, because they're all female until they're male, right?
Yeah, that's true.
even in the egg, it's a female first until the hormones are influencing it to be a male.
Okay.
So I would say the standard is female production. And then, genetics wise, you get a dominant male. I don't know genetics well enough to describe how that works, but
it's okay.
You get a male that is a male maker. Are there different levels of it? Yeah, I think the standard would be mostly female to a handful of males here and there, right? I think these male makers that are making 100% male with no matter what you put it to, I don't think that's the normal, because otherwise, we would have seen it a long time ago, and we'd probably be seeing a heck of a lot more of it.
Right. And especially if you get just an absolutely stunning version of a 100% male maker, people would be tempted to just spread those genetics, and that could actually devastate our population here in the United States, or, put it this way. Thank God David's Deadpool is not a male maker, 100%.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, but even, there's a lot of people out there too, smaller breeders, that might be breeding and not raising up their babies and selling them, and they might be doing this and not knowing it, right?
Absolutely.
And if you perpetuate, now again, right, we only did this for one generation. I guess the next step would be to take those second generation male makers, keep some of the males that they've made, and then do the experiment over again and see what results, and if it waters down or does it become greater. Given the way the genetics work, I think the tendency for them to become greater is probably higher.
Yeah. It'd be interesting. I'm going to keep following Gecko Monster, who's got a 100% male maker that he has from one of David's lines, and he is got a son from him, Klaus's son, I believe, or is it Klaus that's the son? Either way, sorry about that. Yeah, but he's going to be breeding him, I think, next season, and I'm going to be following his lines to see if that male, the male maker makes 100% male maker, or if it kind of tapers off. So, again, even if it's a small data point, I'll take any information I can get. Sure. So, really excited for that kind of stuff.
Now, at this point, I don't know how many out there are actually 100% male makers. So out of mine and Kelly's collection, we identified 2 animals.
Which is saying something. Just for perspective, how many? You said you have groups of 1 to 5 around
1.5
on average.
1.5 is usually what I do.
How many groups are you running currently?
35.
35. So that's a lot of gargoyles.
It's a couple.
So it's a couple. Yeah, more than my wife will let me have. That's for sure. So no, that's awesome. Now, okay. With those 35, one thing I love about coming to your table in your collection is that each individual group, and correct me if I'm wrong here, has a purpose. You have a vision for that group. And so your group 3, if I remember correctly, is a high patterned, high saturation line, right?
Yeah.
And so whether it be blotch, whether it be stripe, whether it be a black and white, whether it be retic, all these things are, tailored to that individual group, which is really kind of a cool way of playing with genetics. When we first talked, you explained to me, and I would love if you could explain it really quickly for our audience, the difference between color versus pattern. So base color versus pattern. What's your take on when people are looking to see, I want a red gecko, that could mean a few different things. Sure. So could you explain that to the audience?
I think you'd have to put it down into 3 categories, really. So pattern, base color, and pattern color. And all 3 sets of those are all, just in color, you have pattern color and base color. Those are separate genetics. And pattern is a distinct set of genetics as well. So pattern is pretty simple. In gargoyles, there's 2 main patterns at the moment, striped or reticulated. Pretty much every other name, orange blotch, super stripe, whatever. All of them will fall under one of those 2 categories, striped or reticulated.
Can I stop you there for 1 second?
Sure.
What about when you mix a stripe and a retic together? Some people will call them mosaics. I don't know if that's just a made-up term. What's your take? Is there a combination pattern?
Well, yes. but it's not quite as simple as just mixing a stripe and a retic. But again, that does fall under one of those two headings. It's a mix or stripe or reticulation. Now, yes, that can be a mosaic. So you can have mosaics that are in a reticulated pattern. You can have mosaics that are more in a stripe pattern. But essentially what a mosaic would be either a mix of both of those patterns, or it wouldn't fall under either striped or retic visually. In some cases, because the patterns get so wonky that you really wouldn't classify.
You don't know where to classify it. Yeah. Okay, so that's pattern.
Yeah. Now, and that stays the same, right? I mean, and what dictates pattern? I see this question all the time. Is it stripe dominant or reticulated dominant? The answer is both. It depends on the genetics of the particular animals you're buying or you're breeding. If one has a longer history in stripes, then that animal's probably going to be more dominant. Dominant is a wrong word. The genetics are going to lean towards striping more than reticulation. And the same thing if you've got a reticulated line that's been reticulated for several generations. You're gonna get more retics out of it than stripes. Now there are some mosaics that are out there that are, people are refining that. You take a mosaic and breed it to it, and you get a couple, and you keep doing that. And will that be a pattern at some time? It probably will. I see more and more being created every year. So sure. Same thing with the bandits. Same thing.
What do you think that bandit is? Just a version of the retic? You think? Yeah.
It's just reorienting the pattern. It's the same thing though. Now color.
Even like the. Oh yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking of the other things I've seen. A lot of people are bringing up, and especially if you look at the Korean market right now, what people are calling skeleton. To me, that's a combination, but it's leaning more towards the stripe, in my opinion. If you look down the dorsal, but what's your take on skeleton? Where does that line up?
That's a tough one because I wouldn't. I find sometimes I don't like those names quite so much because
the names sometimes are horrible.
To me, like if you don't have a line that can reproduce that to some sort of predictability, to me it's hard to give it a name. You know what I mean? Now there are a lot of animals that are going under that skeleton blotch. It's hard to say because everybody's got a different line. Okay. I've got a couple of groups that will hatch out babies that fit that description perfectly. Okay. But by the time they're 3-4 years old, they're not going to be skeleton blotches in my collection. They're going to be super blotches. I get animals that are base colored, but for the first 6 months, they look sort of like that, that they've got that dorsal stripe down the back, a reticulated pattern, but a dorsal stripe. And some of them fade. There are some people out there. Kelly had a line where she was working on that specifically, where it didn't fade. It stayed that way into adulthood. I know there's a couple of other breeders out there that have them that stay that way into adulthood. But in most of those,
we got to refine it more.
Yeah, definitely needs more refinement. Most of those are that I've seen. It's still a reticulated pattern. But the color, all right. So here's where I think base color obviously is exactly what it sounds like. It's the base overall color of the animal. Pattern color is a little more tricky. All right. Pattern color is the blotching that you see in super blotches or blotches. Pattern color is the bright reds and oranges that you see in the stripes. Now the pattern color generally reflects the pattern. It highlights whatever that pattern is, right? So if you've got a reticulated pattern and you throw some pattern color in there, it highlights on those blotching, right? On some of those lines that are in the reticulated pattern. In the stripe pattern, obviously it highlights the stripes back and forth.
Makes sense.
Now you get mixes, just like in pattern, you can have mixes of the reticulated and the striped. We'll call those mosaics. In color and pattern color, this is what I think the skeleton blotches are. It is a reticulated animal, but the color on the back, especially on the back, is oriented in the striped pattern. But there is no striped pattern on most of these animals. They are full retics, but the color is oriented like the stripes.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so in my animals, again, I think it depends on where they come from. Those are out of my groups. They're coming from super blotch groups. By the time the animals are 3 or 4 years old, color fills in. You don't see that skeleton structure anymore because, at least not, if you really look for it, you can see it. But
the skeleton grew a body, it sounds like.
Yeah. More or less. In mine, they turn into super blotches.
Okay. Yeah, because that's the one thing that I like about blotches. I think they're a little underrated. Everybody loves the stripes. I think it's been a dominantly striped, hobby. But with blotches, the amount of spreading that can happen over time, I feel like it's not as confined. And even when you're dealing with, the stripes I pick out and that I have in my collection, they're all broken. They're not clear, crisp lines, right? Because I like that spreading as they get older for more coverage.
Right.
And I know some people breed blotches 2 stripes in order to get that. My best baby I produced this year was just because I didn't have a blotch male ready to go. So I bred one of my nice blotch females to one of my really nice striped males, and the babies are phenomenal. They're all striped, but they've got, you can see like even peppering in between the stripes of blotch pattern and blotch color. So
they'll probably gain more color as they grow, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping so. I'll let you know in a year. But it reminds me, so just for a visual, because a lot of people know David's Tampax, right? That gecko, where it's got all that color on the face. It's got color, randomly all over it. And I believe, I'm not sure if it was that one or another Deadpool Jr. baby, but it was a blotch and a stripe mixed together. And so I think it has a lot of potential.
Well, so you got to understand something though. When you're mixing, okay, so pattern color,
yes,
and base color. Remember, they're separate genetics. Okay, but say you have a stripe that's full color, right? So let's just say Tiki's Deadpool, something like that.
Sure.
And you take that and you breed that to a super blotch that is 90% covered. Okay, what pattern are you going to get? It depends on the dominance, whichever one has more history and whatever, right? But what they have in common is pattern color, full pattern color, right? So regardless of the pattern that comes out of your babies, what you could expect is all of them having tons of pattern color, because that's
what you're breeding for.
That's a trait you've just crossed up, regardless of pattern and all that kind of stuff. So can you get super blotches by breeding a blotch to a stripe? Absolutely. You can get super blotches by breeding 2 stripes. I've done
it. Right. Yeah. It's just the genetics line up, and that's the dominant trait right there.
Right.
You just kind of blew my mind right there, kind of thinking through. I mean, we've talked about this before, but just hearing you say it right now, that you're breeding for pattern color. Right. That drove it home for me. Hopefully it drives it home for the audience too.
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, when I was first trying to do the super blotches, like you said, stripes have always been the highest demand. We didn't have super blotches when I started, right? The best we had were blotches. And so in trying to make super blotches, the first handful that I got, you need a male, but I didn't have males. So what do? I bred it to the highest color stripe that I had. And that's how I got some of my first super blotches. Then you take those super blotches and keep going. And, the idea with most of my groups, how you were saying before, how they have goals.
Right.
Because of the high degree of polymorphism that I was seeing in the gargoyles, one of my goals, in order to increase predictability, right? I mean, because really that's what we're trying to do. We like these specific traits. We want to be able to reproduce them with predictability. So the idea that I went at it with was, instead of, I'm trying to isolate certain genetics, right? So like in the yellows, when I first started breeding the yellows, trying to make yellows, I was buying yellow animals. I'd raise them up. They'd turn orange. Sometimes they do go red. breed them.
Yep.
They don't make yellows. Even the ones that I buy that were really nice yellow, I'd breed them. They didn't make yellows. They made oranges and they made reds predominantly. So I started backwards. I thought the way I was seeing the color progression and what I was seeing coming out of my animals, I was kind of under the assumption that color was actually working differently in these guys than it does in a lot of other animals. You know, and some of the other animals we work with, we can manipulate the reds, the yellows, the oranges. We can manipulate them independently. And I'm not saying we can't do that in the Gargs, but what I think, I guess the best analogy I think is happening, I think that color in the gargoyles is a set of genetics, right? That red, yellow, and orange may not be separate. I think it's one set of genetics.
Stacks, in my opinion.
Yes. Right? So yellow, if in an easy explanation, yellow would be like a 25% expression, orange is a 50% expression, red is the 100% expression. Right? So trying to make yellow from red animals was almost impossible. I just couldn't.
You can't take the color out.
No, it
not easily.
You probably can, but it was, that's a heck of a longer road.
Yes.
Especially since we've been trying to build it up for so many years. So to start off with my yellows, I started picking out my black and whites because, I think we talked about the black and whites in the beginning.
Yeah.
Most black and whites are not black and white. Most black and whites are brown and yellow for the most part. So I was keeping my yellowest black and whites, right? And my black and white line I had already established. It did not produce color. No reds and no oranges. So that's where my yellows started. And then by breeding yellows back to yellows over and over again, I believe that I've isolated that yellow trait now into a line where they only produce yellows. They don't, unless I mix another line into them, that line itself will only produce yellows.
Now, when you say yellows, though, are you talking about base color yellows or are you talking pattern color yellows? Because a lot of people who say, I've got a yellow, it's a base color yellow and it has no pattern color.
So far,
yes,
I would hesitate to say pattern color in yellow, right? Because I have not seen, or at least not what I'm looking for. I've seen a couple of adults that have yellow in the pattern color areas, but it's still oriented like base color, just in the pattern areas, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah.
Very, very. In my yellow line, honestly, that's the only animals that I've seen that are getting close enough to where you can say it's a pattern color. When I can get that in stripes, it gets a little fuzzy. When I breed that into the retics and I can get a super blotch that's yellow, that'll be the game changer because then we'll have pattern color that's yellow.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what's hard is I actually saw a baby, I forget who posted it on Morph Market like this week. And it was it was fired down and you could see the pattern color was yellow, but it was young. So I'm like, this thing is going to turn orange. Like easily it's going to turn orange. And my girl, Hawaii, if you see her in person in the sunlight, she is yellow, yellow pattern. However, depends on, I don't know if it's her cycle or what it is. Sometimes I open up her enclosure and it's orange. Sometimes I open up her enclosure and she's, paler yellow. Mm-hmm. When she's fired down, it definitely looks yellow. But to me, it's a mustardy, orangey yellow, even that stacking. So she's about as close as I've seen, and I have no lineage on her. I got her from a pet store. So I don't know what she came out of. But yeah, she's the closest I've seen so far as pattern color.
I have a couple adults that are really dark that have yellow stripes, right? So if you just looked at pictures and did comparisons, you would probably say, well, that looks like yellow pattern color to me. But if you'd seen the animal grow up and you'd seen it go through the changes and all that stuff, in my opinion, it's not quite the same.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you can isolate it out. Speaking of your groups, what are some of the groups that you're the most excited about that are, if you don't mind sharing one or two that obviously we're all looking at red stripes and red super blotches, but like, what are you the most excited about when you're opening up your enclosures? when you're putting together new
I
groups.
like the super blotches.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I've kind of focused on for many years already. Though that's my so I think I said this with David's interview too.
Sure.
One of the things that really hooked me with the gargoyles in the beginning was how different every single animal was. Even the stripes, right? So now we have all these perfectly striped animals. Those didn't exist in the beginning. We made those. It took a long time to make those, but we made them, right?
Yep.
And as much as I love the accomplishment, I mean, because it as far as that goes, it was a big deal to be able to get that out of these animals. The problem that I have with it is now that we've established these perfect stripes, all these perfect striped animals actually look alike for the most part, except for color. Whereas the blotching, even though we get super blotches, very, very rarely do two super blotches still look alike.
Yeah, it's an individual thumbprint.
Yeah.
I actually have an amazing super blotch coming tomorrow. It's a male, and I'm like over the moon, kind of like Christmas tomorrow for it. Cool. So, yep,
coming from Dragonborn.
Not ready to go. About I think 14 grams. So
got a little bit of
nothing. Got some time, but that's okay. But if you saw how covered it is at 14 grams, I'll post a picture of it right here. But I'm just excited because it's other than I do have one super nice blotch right now from Renee King, but he's a red base, and red base on red, he's awesome, but he looks 10 times better fired down.
Yeah.
When he's fired up, he's just a solid red gecko. And so, but they're all so unique, and just seeing the pictures you post, I keep eyeing the gecko. Maybe we'll talk after this. You've got one on Morph Market right now. That is that kind of banded look, and you posted a picture of a sibling that showed the red eventually that it would turn into, and I'm like, I could get behind that. That even just the different, like you said, these are all patterns too. The difference in the blotch pattern, I feel like, is so varied. Right? Some of them are big, giant, like slabs. Mm-hmm. Some are little tiny dots. Some are bands. Some are, there's just so much more to it. So I'm right there with you. I'm excited to see what we do with them.
I'm making a couple this year. I've hatched out a couple already that, they're small. So we'll have to see what happens when they grow. But tiger stripes, easiest description. Yep. It looks like tiger stripes.
Yep. I can send you my address if you want to just lose one. I'm happy to help you with that. So, because I think that's so cool. Maybe I'll get my wife on board because her favorite animal is a tiger, and so if I get something that looks sort of like a tiger, maybe she'll start cleaning enclosures. Who knows? So, what about the other trait that's really popular right now? Is eyebrows and head color. Mm-hmm. Do you have any groups focused on just those things? And is there anything for us smaller breeders that if we're picking out babies, that you have some advice for us if we're trying to develop head color? Do you need to buy an adult or one with already head color, or can it develop over a certain technique?
Yes, and yes. All of the so head, I think the head colors really started to show up in the last couple of years. I think Phil Tremper is probably one of the spear points for that. He's had one of the nicer lines making head color, and has really made some headway in it. I think a lot of it. I think a lot of it is any super blotch, any animal that has been bred specifically with tons of saturation and tons of pattern color is likely to produce head color. I think just that's the natural progression. We're making the animals, we're making animals that exhibit more and more pattern color every year, and so now we've got animals where everything but the head is covered. So the next logical step is to start covering the head. Yep.
Now we've run out of room in Asia and Europe. We got to go to America. It's like it just keeps spreading. Yep. And I think it's gorgeous, just seeing it. And there's a difference too between, I see a difference between the eyebrows and then like there's sort of geckos that where I feel like it's almost, especially with the stripes, an extension of those stripes down the ridge of the nose, and then also in the lipsticks, as people call it, with their lips. And so I don't know if it's truly an extension of those lines or if I'm just making that up, but it kind of looks that way to me.
I think it is. It is.
So,
and when we expand the color, and so those don't always show up either. If I think if you look at David's Tampax, you look at when it was a baby. If I remember correctly, I don't think it had all that color on the face. So, some of these animals, sometimes you don't know until they're 2 years old if it's going to have that kind of color on the face and head.
And that's where I think something's different with the face color like that gecko has versus, when I see some of the eyebrows in Phil's, babies, or, the Sam Shee babies that he's posting with the giant, Eugene Levy size eyebrows. Those usually I've actually heard two different things, and maybe you can enlighten me on this, that the eyebrows specifically, you can see pretty quickly if a baby has like the spots, to either expand or sometimes they just disappear completely. Well, and I guess that's the case with a lot of blotch color too.
Sure. I think in Phil's lines for sure, because I've got a couple of his babies too. And yeah, they were noticeable from the beginning. I've hatched out babies that within 2 months, 3 months of age, you can start to see some, especially I'm kind of blind, so I tend to use magnification when I'm looking at the babies. But yeah, there are some that you can see scales right off the bat. But again, it depends. I mean, at least in my collection, it's not to the point where I have predictability and I can say, this line is going to produce them. This line is going to produce them. I don't have any groups at this up until next season. Next season, I'll have a group together specifically for that.
Very cool.
Up to this point, I have not had a group specifically for that, but I do have groups that are making them more often, than anybody else. My group 10, which isn't even for that kind of stuff, is actually this year made more of them than anybody else, and I'm not sure why, but that's how it works.
Well, and that's the fun of this too. So many times I've talked to breeders and they're like, "That wasn't my plan, but it just kind of popped out, and the right male got it with the right female, and all of a sudden here it goes." So
I've seen changes in my, in what the group. Because I run groups, I don't always know exactly which mom is mom until the baby grows up. Right. And I can compare a little bit better. But I have seen there are some, groups that I've kept together for several seasons in a row. They don't always produce the same thing year after year. I might get heavy pattern color in one year and might get not so heavy in another year. Some possibilities for that. I may be getting one female that's producing particularly heavy one year, and then she doesn't produce particularly heavy the next year. That's possible. But I have had other groups where I've had groups together for many, many seasons, and then all of a sudden they start producing something completely different than they've ever made before. And then the following year, it goes back to what they did before. I think
it's because you're messing with their diet.
I think what it is it really comes down to the polymorphism. Yeah. I mean, just because I'm trying to breed some predictability into the animals. Nothing is 100%. So I think it's that randomness just kind of peeks its head out once in a while still.
Yeah. And I preach to people that if you're looking for predictability, breeders like yourself, I mention you all the time, and I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure that Northern Gecko breeds very similar in groups for different purposes. But, the average breeder isn't doing that to the extent that you are. And so I said, if anybody's looking for a specific trait, go to RhacHouse because he'll tell you what group to buy from, and it makes a huge difference. Because you breed in groups too, though, I've heard in some of your other interviews or just, talking to you, that sometimes you'll rotate in different males or females into groups as long as they fit into that vision, right? How often would you say you are swapping out animals? Do you have some animals that have been together for 10 plus years, or do you rotate animals out every 5 years? Does it change?
Depends. It depends.
Okay.
If I've got a better, like for an orange blotch group, right off the bat, my group 25, orange blotches. The last 3 seasons, I think I've switched out the male. I hold back a lot of animals. I've probably got 400 holdbacks that I'm raising up just to see.
Holy cow, that's awesome.
And then I try to keep backups for every So I learned a long time ago, right? Because sometimes things go wrong. And if you don't have a backup for a certain project, it can stall a project out for years. So I try to keep backups. Yeah. So really what it comes down to, I go back and I'll look and see what the production was. If I was getting what I wanted out of that year, if I've got a better male that's more suited for the project than the last one, then he'll get swapped out. But usually those animals are coming from the same, not from the same lines, but from the same goal.
Yep. Because you have multiple groups with the same goal, so that you can go and use the offspring to mix them around without inbreeding or line breeding. Exactly. Do we want to touch on the difference between line breeding and inbreeding with geckos and what? I know you have a rule, but do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't put anything together that's related closer than 3 generations. They got to be separated by 3 generations at least. Now that being said, right, because these are island species, they are inbreeding naturally. The polymorphism, in my opinion, is Mother Nature's answer to the inbreeding. That's how it works over there. So could you take and you could breed mom and dad? I mean, breeding siblings back to mom and dad really is not that big a deal, no matter what species you're looking at. And these guys, I think you could probably breed siblings together and not have any ill effects whatsoever. The problem with that is why. It doesn't do your animals do any good. It doesn't do the trade any good. It just doesn't make any sense when there's so many more genetics to choose from. Yeah.
No, I like it because we only have so many, and as of right now, like you said, the odds are in our favor. These animals, I always say, as you go down the evolutionary chain, right? Line breeding, inbreeding becomes less of an issue, right? Large mammalian animals, you have more issues. Whereas if you get down to, like fish get inbred all the time,
exactly.
And with no ill effect whatsoever. It doesn't mean that there aren't ill effects, but those usually get culled and weeded out,
Correct.
so that they don't spread those genetics. Same thing, if you got a deformed gargoyle, you're not going to breed it, kind of thing. But why risk it? I agree.
Doesn't make any sense.
We're having fun here. We're so why taint the water?
Having a large collection like mine it affords me a couple different things. I can experiment. A lot of my animals I produce myself. I mean, do I buy animals every year? I do, 100%. But do I also use my own animals? Absolutely, but that's why I run 5 different groups for whatever trade I'm doing. I can take the best ones from all 5 of those groups and put them together, and they're completely unrelated. And as long as I stick to my rule where they're more than 3 generations apart, so far I haven't seen any ill effects in my animals whatsoever.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you'd be a fool not to keep your best and use it in your own breeding projects. Right. I mean, why spend $10,000 on a top end gecko when you're already producing one? So that's awesome. One other thing that I want to talk to you about, kind of a trend going on right now, is I don't know if it's a trend. I don't know if I should say that, but a lot of people are talking about size. Wild genetics, F1s. I have an F1 female, How much do you think that matters with gargoyles? Do you think all the gargoyles in nature are 80 plus grams with perfect horn
No.
structure? You know what I mean? Or is that something that is a trait that some people are breeding for, and maybe there's some wild genetics that lean towards that? What's your take on all of this?
Well, since I've never been to New Caledonia, it's hard for me to speak on the wild population, right, with certainty.
Yeah.
What I can
Let's get a
tell
group
you,
together and go, though. That'd be fun.
actually, I would love to do that.
Yeah, it'd be great.
What I can tell you is in the beginning, all right, when I was working for Sandfire, now this is before I'm breeding my own, right? So I'm basically selling Alan's animals.
Sure.
Average adult size for gargoyles was 40 to 45 grams. That was average adults.
Okay.
Maybe you get some of the older ones that be in the 55s, but this is also pre-diet, right? So this is before the diets came about. So mind you, nutrition's gotten better, right? Where people like big animals, you breed big animals, they make big babies, and that keeps happening.
Sure.
Yeah, this idea that for me anyway, that I see on the internet, the idea that this animal has to be 65 grams to breed it, I don't understand. I don't understand that cutoff. Because number one, they weren't that big in the beginning, and number two, I really have a problem with using weight as a benchmark. It should be maturity, not weight.
Okay. So what's your standard then?
3 years. 3 years minimum.
3 years minimum. Okay.
3 years minimum. Yeah.
So if they're laying duds, it doesn't matter.
The way that I see it, right? It's you could use the analogy. I always go back to people, right? Because people can relate to people.
Yeah, hopefully,
to some degree, at least, right?
To some degree.
So, in humans, our little girls can start going through puberty at 11 or 12 years old. Okay, they start to cycle. Okay, so technically, they're capable of reproduction, right? No,
fair.
No. So
you shouldn't.
So in the New Caledonian geckos, in my opinion, the benchmark of 2 years age, it's laying duds. Go ahead and breed it. No, I don't agree with that. I think that's when the reproductive system first is coming online. It's not developed yet. It's just coming online. The proof of that is in the beginning when I used to tell people, once they start to ovulate after 2 years of age, you can start breeding them. I always followed that up with, don't expect perfect clutches, don't expect 2 egg clutches, and don't expect a clutch every month for your first year, right? And that was normal.
What is what I hear all the time.
Yeah. Once I started waiting until over 3 years, all of that went away. I don't have that problem anymore. And I would even argue that, maybe even waiting for some animals, right? So in my collection, I do everything. All my pairing is done according to the time of year. I think you can break it down into 3 sections for these guys. There's the off season, there's the breeding season, and there's an egg laying season. I don't manipulate my animals. I don't set the light cycle or anything. So they're together. And what they do is driven strictly by nature. Barometric pressure and light cycle, in my opinion, are the 2 drivers. Right. So I see my animals begin to start breeding in the beginning of November. The end of October, the beginning of November is when they start to breed. The winter solstice, in my opinion, is what I would call the peak of breeding season. By definition, what I'm saying is that is the pinnacle of when the females are putting out pheromones and actually calling the males in. After the winter solstice, that starts to wane a little bit. The females aren't calling the males in quite so much. I think by the end of January, for the most part, that's kind of stalled out, and now you're into egg laying season. Doesn't mean they won't breed. I'm just saying that for the most part, the females aren't calling males in. That's how I pair them. If my animals aren't 3 years old by the winter solstice and ready to go, they don't get paired. So they may wait till 4 years old. I have some animals that wait till 5. The longer you wait, I think ultimately the better production you get.
So And I've heard that a lot too, of waiting at least till 3 years, and it makes sense if you've got to cut off. I actually really respect that. At 3 years, right? We said that you don't have to wait till there's 60, 65, grams. What would you say in your larger collection, if you could estimate, what would you say the average female is in your collection?
Probably 55 grams.
About 55 grams at 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay. But at 2 years, it's not uncommon for them to be 40, 45 grams.
No, not at all.
Okay. So not only are they putting on some extra size, but it's the maturity that's the benchmark.
Well,
for
you. I think maturity
makes sense.
The analogy I use at the shows is, all right, so say if you went to the doctor, you wanted to have a baby, right? And the doctor said, well, you know what? You're not quite 775 pounds. You probably shouldn't have a kid yet. Doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
Yeah. So wait.
Well, and I think there's in chasing large, hopefully it's large size, structure, right? But there are some fat geckos out there, and I think that'll be detrimental as well.
Absolutely.
Try to power feed your animals.
That's a whole, we could sit and talk about that too.
What do you think is the detriment there?
Metabolism is directly affects lifespan. All right. And it does seem like in general, there does seem to be this race to get your geckos as big as possible, as fast as possible. And, you got a 55 gram animal in a year, everybody's cheering on. Now, I don't want to say that's a bad thing, right? Because
genetically will get there.
Exactly. It kind of depends. But in my experiments in the early days to try to figure out whether they were temperature sex dependent, basically I was incubating eggs at every temperature between 65 and 85, right? And all kinds of experiments. One of the experiments I did was I was taking clutches I was running 2 incubators, one at 72, one at 76, and I would separate a clutch of eggs, put 1 egg in each incubator. The eggs were hatching 30 days apart, 30 days separate. So 4 degrees basically sped up with the metabolism by 30%, right? Because we're usually looking at about 90-ish days, give or take. So
Absolutely.
If 4 degrees sped up the metabolism in the egg, right? Because that's technically that's what happens. If the egg is hatching faster, then clearly the rate is higher in that egg because it's maturing faster, right? So 4 degrees sped up the incubation by 30%, right? So in my mind, you could actually take that same calculation and apply that to an adult living animal, right? So if we got animals that truly if these are living 30 years, okay, and that is completely normal to go 30 plus years. And let's say that you're keeping that animal at, 78, 79 degrees, the optimum temperature for gargoyles. And you're keeping that temperature all the time and you're all throughout the year, right? Then I would argue that you could be speeding up the metabolism by 30%, right? By not cooling it down and not doing. So then if you've got an animal that's living 30 years, 30% off of 30 years is 10 years, right?
Yep,
so
that's
I mean,
a huge difference.
That's a big difference. Now you throw in all the other factors. If you're breeding the animal, depending on what you're feeding it and all these other kind of stuff. I want good production, but I also want my animals to live.
Right. No, I think it's mind-blowing how much of an effect it has. I mean, even just this year, I went from just incubating, my room is usually around 72 degrees, right? It's in my upstairs, my kid's bedroom's right down the hallway. So it's like I can't jack up the heat and control it at 78. My family would be roasting. But, I put an incubator in here. I made one. And I incubated at room temperature last year, and it took anywhere from 90 to 120 days for the longest. This year, I've got them in the incubator. I'm incubating at around 77, 78. It fluctuates a degree or two. And my babies are hatching out on average 65 to 75 days at max. I know exactly what week they're going to hatch consistently this time. And so I wonder if doing that with the egg, because I haven't seen, my babies have been bigger than they were last year. And maybe it's just because I'm in the female's second year, right? That she's a little more mature.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the factor.
That'll
But I
play a
wonder
role.
if there's a detriment to the babies that were hatched faster versus hatched slower long term if I don't cook them through their adulthood, through their actual lifespan.
So again, on the
sense.
internet, piece of information that I see get passed on quite a bit is the faster you incubate them, the smaller the babies are.
I don't believe that.
I don't agree with that.
No.
Well, yes and no. I do agree with it, but I don't agree with it. I don't think it has as much to do with temperature as it has to do with humidity.
Okay.
You incubate at a higher temperature, your humidity is probably going to be lower, right? And so what I see is, because typically I don't use incubators. I incubate on the shelf in my animal room. On the occasions that I have used incubators, whether I'm experimenting with it or whatever, especially when I was up north where the ambient humidity isn't quite as high, there would be times where my humidity, I'd have a water dish in the incubator to keep the humidity up, and I would forget to check it, and that water would go dry, and I would notice that when that water reserve was dry, that my babies were coming out smaller, same temperature, but there wasn't as much humidity in the incubator, and the babies would come out smaller. So yeah, I mean, is it temperature that's causing the smaller babies? I guess you could argue that because temperature is affecting the humidity, but I think humidity is the real reason why you're going to see smaller babies.
Interesting. So give me a second. I want to show you what I'm keeping like the container in, because I'm not having small babies in an incubator, but it makes sense with your what you're saying, because they're in each. I have a cup, right, and each cup has its own medium in there, so it's not just incubating in open air and I've got to humidify the air. I have it in an enclosed area that stays humid, and I actually keep it a little more humid than even the directions say. And it's working beautifully. So let me just grab it for a visual real quick. One second. All right. So this is the incubator this is the what I put in the incubator. These are made by Redline. And so it's got a lid that keeps it on. You can see the well, hopefully you can. Can you see the condensation there?
Mm-hmm.
So I have to actually, that's what I'm looking for.
Does that cup have air holes in it, or do you just open it?
No, I just open it every so often.
Yeah.
I do not put air holes.
I'd bet money that's a big contributor to your big babies. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm happy with the results, so I'll keep going with it. But yeah, I mean, so if humidity is that important while incubating, take it a step further. Let's 100%. Talk about what does it do to your adults, and where do you keep your humidity at? Because a lot of people say, miss the crap out of them once, twice a day, get them nice and soaked, and then dry them out.
No.
Is that
Absolutely
good advice?
Absolutely not. That actually makes my head hurt.
Okay.
It really does.
Let's fix your headache. What should people do?
Well, okay, so some of this stems, I think, from care. I'm not a fan of care sheets. I hate instructions without context.
Cover your ass sheets?
Yes. And that's actually a good point. I'm glad you said that, because I think that's exactly what this stems from. All right. Yes. So in the old days, when we're spreading the word for the new Caledonian geckos, right? The vast majority of the United States is not like here in Florida, where we've got 70, 80% humidity standard. Most of the United States is 40% or lower on average. All right. Now, if we're telling you that these animals require 75% humidity, and you're doing that with a squirt bottle, then you are going to be spraying, say you're in Minnesota and your ambient humidity is 40%, and you're trying to maintain 75%. You're going to be squirting the crap out of that thing, right? And so these animals require high humidity, but the caveat to that is the enclosure cannot be wet. Wet enclosures kill. All right. So when we were telling people how to take care of them, it was usually something like, you've got to spray 2 or 3 times or whatever it is. and then let it dry out. And what we meant by that was, because you are wetting the cage, you're squirting the cage, you have to let the surface of the cage dry out. Now, somewhere along the line, that dry out has turned into a dry out period, where now it's usually followed up with instructions like spray it, and then you want it to dry out to 50% humidity. That doesn't make any sense to me. If you do any research on your own and find out what New Caledonia is like, New Caledonia is an island in the middle of the ocean with wind blowing across it constantly. If you look at any information based on the island, and this is what's important, I think people need to pay attention to, is averages. This tells you what the animals are used to. The annual average in New Caledonia is something like 74, 75%. The annual average high is like 90%. The annual average low is like 70%. That tells me that on the island, overall, it is almost like never going below 70%. Right. So now,
how do you achieve that? Well, if you're up north,
that's tough. That can be tough. A lot of that's going to depend on what your ambient humidity is. My number one recommendation is cage selection. Pick a cage that holds humidity. Number one. Right. Avoid screen tops. Avoid open tops. Humidity rises with heat. Have your ventilation on the sides. The biggest argument I get against maintaining 70% consistently is respiratory infection and mold or bacteria buildup. And again, that kind of hurts my head, because high humidity doesn't cause respiratory infection or mold buildup. Neither one of those, because if it was, then New Caledonia would be run over, right? What causes those things is lack of air circulation.
Okay.
Plain and simple. So you need to keep 70% humidity, but you also have to have good air circulation. Otherwise, you are going to wind up with problems. And it goes for any animal. It doesn't matter what it is.
Right. But we just said if you're up north like where I am, up in Chicagoland area. If I do all PVC with no, ventilation on top, and I do it, on sides, that's not a lot of airflow. Well, so do I put in fans? What do you do?
In my building, I got ceiling fans, and I have several fans that sit on the floor that circulate the air in the entire building.
Okay.
I run humidifiers in my building for that same reason. I try not to spray. Do I spray? I do. But my goal is not to, because I don't want wet enclosures. What I recommend for people that buy my animals, I recommend foggers. Foggers on a timer.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yes, I had a guest on earlier who mentioned foggers. So what do you recommend there? So if I was buying a gecko from you, what advice would you give me?
Unfortunately, I can't recommend brands because I don't use the foggers myself. So I don't have I don't have experience with the units that most people are going to buy for one or two geckos.
Because you're in Florida, you don't need them.
Right. Well, I'm running an industrial humidifier in my building, right? So when I turn it on and you walk in my building, it's like walking in the rainforest. You got to part the fog to walk in. So cage selection. All right. So a solid top doesn't mean lack of ventilation. It's one of the reasons why I recommend the plastic tubs. You can make them yourself. Stagger your vents. When I'm instructing people on what to do, I like, if you're not looking for something that is visually appealing, right? So then you want some, a nice bioactive, then this isn't going to work for you. But plastic tubs, in my opinion, for every other reason or every other aspect for gargoyles, they work better. You can ventilate them yourself, right? So stagger the vents on one side, make the vents as high as you can put them on the enclosure, and on the exact opposite side, you put them as low as you can make them. And so the idea behind that is when the air warms up inside the enclosure and it rises, it goes out the two top vents. By nature, it pulls in cool, fresh air in those bottom vents, right? So you have an enclosure that will maintain humidity to some degree, but still promote some sort of air circulation within that enclosure.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I mean, that's how I started because it is the cheapest way. I mean, and I know some huge name breeders that use only tubs because it's the most effective way, and they're not looking to do a giant display.
Yes.
And so I actually just moved into these displays, right? And I'm actually battling a little bit, going against your advice, because they do have a really nice solid screen top. It's not that mesh you get on an Exoterra, but I actually have. I'll show you this. I'll actually get up and show you real quick. So I have plastic tops.
Oh, okay.
And it fits right over it, and it keeps in the humidity better because I've blocked it with the same plastic. Now it's not perfect, and I'm actually going to go buy some, PVC or some kind of plastic, so it's a little bit flatter and does a better job. But yeah, and I've got the side vents open so that there's some airflow, and I did what you said. When I was putting these together, I could choose whether I wanted the hole to be up top or down below based on how I put them together. And so, knowing the physics of how air moves, hopefully I could do something right. But
yeah. And if you've got a fan in that room to circulate the air in that room, that makes a huge difference.
Right up there.
Yeah.
It's ugly. It's from the 90s, but it works.
No, but it works.
I mean, you could say the same thing about me. I grew up in the 90s, so very cool. I love that.
I'm not going to tell you what year I grew up in.
Nah, it's okay. So, you're what? 29, 30?
27. No.
27, yeah.
No.
No. It's okay. As long as we look young, it's all good. No, that's awesome. So we've talked a lot about, how humidity can really affect the gecko, how keeping them wet is not the way to go. And so one thing I do in these enclosures, I would love to get your take on it, is so when I don't use a lay box, I have cocoa chunk mixed with peat moss as my substrate, which if you have a better suggestion, I'd love to hear from you with that. But it holds the humidity from what I can tell pretty well, especially in all my other enclosures. And I mount it up into one corner, and the girls lay there 100% of the time. I can see them digging. It's by the front. But one thing I noticed is, when I'm spraying, to try to keep it not wet, I'll do a light mist on the furniture of it, right? All the branches and hides and things like that, the cork bark, but I don't soak it. I will spray the sides of the enclosure a little bit heavier, and then I will also go and spray a lot in the substrate, because I feel like unless they're digging, they're not down there very often. So coming into contact with that isn't the worst. But do you have any take on that strategy? Do you think that that's okay to be, I'll even sometimes take a pitcher of water, and if the substrate's really drying out, like with these when I'm battling it, and just pour water down there, not where it's pooling, but where I fully saturate it, because I'd rather do that with the humidity.
Yeah, I mean, if it seems to be working for you, there's a million ways to skin a cat, right? If it's working for you,
sure.
Go for it. I mean, don't
go for it. Yeah.
Now there are a couple things that I would caution, right?
Please do. Yep.
So you are using the cocoa coir, I think you said, right? Cocoa coir and peat moss for your substrate?
So it's like a cocoa chunk. It's the Repti chip, basically.
Oh, chip.
It's
okay.
It's the Repti chip, the breeder blocks.
Right. Yeah. No, that's cool. I was thinking it was the coir, which is the real fine stuff.
No.
Yeah, that you want to stay away from. Yes. Yeah. When that's wet and it gets in there, I've seen it kill geckos. If it gets in their mouth, they can't spit it out. They try to swallow it and they choke. The only other thing I would say is how your setup is. I mean, you mentioned though you got to kind of push back in the corner. The only reason I don't do that is because then you can't control where they lay the eggs. In all of mine, I use newspaper for the substrate. That is specifically to prevent them from laying wherever they want.
Wherever they want.
Right. So mine do use the lay boxes dang near 100%. In fact, the only time I think that they don't is when the eggs are obviously no good. They know.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting about how I do it is I keep it's the same substrate, absolutely this exact same, but I only put I'm talking about a half inch everywhere else in the enclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll mound up that one corner up front. It's in every corner here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see, it's that corner there.
Okay.
It's about, I would say, 4 to 5 inches deep.
Yeah, that's
So
plenty.
it's the only place in the enclosure. So when I actually, what's really cool is right before bed, after the lights go out for about 30, 40 minutes, I'll come in here with a flashlight when I know that, the girl's, when she's about 40, 45 days from her last lay,
Mm-hmm.
I'll go to see if she's digging. And if she's in that corner hanging out, I know that I should go
Mm-hmm.
look for eggs the next day. So just my own little strategy, which is kind of fun.
I kind of, now, just because my collection is so big, I don't have time to go through every night and do that. But
I'd be impressed.
in the beginning, mine were set up the same. All my nest boxes were right up in front. So what I do every night before I go to bed is I go through there with a flashlight and just shine through. And if anybody was nesting in the box, I write, all of mine have the ID numbers, right? So if I saw somebody nesting in the box, I write down the ID number, stick it on the front of the tub, and then go back and check the next morning. And, most of the time, there'd be something there. And with multiple females too, actually, all I have to do, because I get questions all the time, how do you know, right? I don't know 100%, but more often than not, all I really have to do is catch 2 females laying. And I can do this at any time, as long as I write down every time I collect eggs. All I have to do is catch females laying twice within the season, because then with deduction, I can figure out what cycle everybody's on and figure out when they were supposed to lay and have a really good idea of who's who.
Yeah, that makes sense, because even right now, I know. So my girl Tiga just laid her first set of fertile eggs ever, and I just tracking her duds before that, I knew that she was due to lay again. My next girl that's going to lay, I can put money on it, is my girl Khalik. She's due in about 2 to 3 days, give or take, another 2 or 3 days, and I'll keep an eye on her, and then my next one after that is Bimini. I know who's on deck, who's ready to go, and very, very rarely do they mix it up on me. It has happened. Where all of a sudden 2 girls, one girl laid early, one girl laid late, and now all of a sudden they're on almost the same day, if not the same night. But I keep mine all separate, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, no, it's kind of cool how you can make these things more predictable. Right. Question about your groups. So with your groups, how big of an enclosure do you recommend if someone wants to, emulate your setup, right? How big of an enclosure, or how big of a tub, if you're using tubs, do you put, 5-6 geckos in where they're safely in there?
Well, that's another point of contention that I have with what's typically out there.
All right, I'm asking good questions then.
I look at it slightly different. All right.
Okay.
So whenever you have an animal that you're housing, you want to give it as much space as possible, no matter what, right?
Sure.
But the definition of space is different depending on the animal. All right. So all of our geckos are arboreal. So for arboreal geckos, space is not dictated by the dimensions of the enclosure. Space is dictated by the volume of surface area within the enclosure. Now, if you take that fact, you can make a small enclosure really, really big and have lots and lots of room. The more stuff that you put in there for them to climb on, the more surface area, the more space they have. So I use predominantly for my breeders, I use egg crate for my furniture. I use all paper products. That way when I clean, I just take everything out, throw it away, and replace it. I have 2 different styles for my adult enclosures. Some of the tubs are from the very beginning, and I can't buy those tubs anymore, and some are newer tubs. My older tubs are actually the smaller tubs. All right, so my egg crates are 12 by 12. My early tubs are measurement wise, external dimensions are like 13.5 by 13.5 by 20 something long. All right. So
okay.
They're really not much bigger than an Exoterra, a 1818 Exoterra, or 1212 Exoterra. But because I'm putting egg crate in there and the way that I fit it in there, I actually put 7 flats of egg crate in there. All right. Each crate is 12 by 12. That's a square foot. So within the dimensions of your average Exoterra, I have 7 square feet of usable climbable space for my geckos.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what it comes down to. So my cages really aren't any bigger than they need. In fact, I argue that unless you're talking about a really mature animal, most of the animals do better in smaller enclosures, even as adults.
And I agree with
you. I can give you my theories as to why, but I mean, it is what it is. They do. That's a fact.
And I noticed that, I mean, especially when you think of babies, right?
Especially
every
babies.
breeder especially babies, right? Because they're going to be predated on. They usually stay within a certain area. They're nervous, not until they're older, more comfortable, more confident, right? And you can see it in, I don't care if it's gargoyles, leeches, bearded dragons. You put a baby bearded dragon in a, 4 by 2 by 2. You're asking for problems.
Sure.
Right?
Exposure.
So, yes, they need to feel confined and safe. So I'm with you. But yeah, I think there's a reason I didn't buy 2 by 2s.
When I first discovered this, right? So when I was experimenting, trying to figure out whether they're temperature dependent again, because a lot of it comes back to that. I'm incubating at all kinds of temperatures, right? Like I told you, I incubated all the way up to 85. You know how quick they hatch at 85 degrees?
No, tell us, please.
Like 30 days. Yeah, I'm not telling you to do it because don't do it. But right, they pop out fast.
That's crazy.
All right, so I'm experimenting.
Were they smaller? Can I ask?
Yes, they were smaller.
Yeah, I would assume.
So I'm experimenting with temperatures. All right, so one day I come out and I check my incubator and I've got like 15 babies out that, quite honestly, I wasn't expecting them to hatch. I wasn't expecting them to hatch that quick. I didn't have enclosures for them, right? So I run down to the kitchen, raid the cabinet for my food containers, the little Glad 4-cup food containers. Now, previous to this, I would start them in a 6-quart tub shoebox. And they would do a complete shed within 1 or 2 days, but it would generally take a week or so for them to really eat, right? I mean, to eat a good meal. So I have all these babies. I don't have tubs for them. I run downstairs, grab all the food containers that I can, bring them back upstairs, put all these babies in the food container, food and water in them, go to bed. I wake up the next morning, go check on them, and I almost fell on the floor because every single one of these babies that I put in that container cleaned the bowl the first night. Okay.
No way.
All of them, they had eaten so well the first time that their bellies were distended and they could not lay flat. That's how big the bellies were. And I said, wait a second.
Okay.
Something, clearly something is different here.
Babies don't do that.
They didn't do that for me before then. Right. So now, so now I got to play with it. Now I got to start experimenting it and try to understand. And so I start raising them, starting them out in these 4-cup containers, right? If 4 cups is pretty darn small.
It's tiny.
It's big enough for a food dish, a water dish, and a little section of egg crate. And
I would think to put a baby Yuri in there.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All the new Caledonian geckos. I do it with every single one of them. Because they do better, period. Right? And so not only that, but the crested geckos. You've been to my table a couple of times. Absolutely. You don't come to my table and see crested geckos without tails. I don't have them. My crested geckos all have tails. My breeders, I got 10-year-old breeders with tails. I have people buy cressets from me and come back and say, you know what, man, your cresset, I bought cresset from XYZ, and your cressets are just so calm and they're so easy to handle. What is the difference? And I attribute that to the smaller containers. Two things for cresset geckos. The smaller, raising them individually, number one, and raising them small. When they're in those small containers, there is no threat, right? So you're familiar with dogs, you have kids, so you're going to understand this. All life forms do their main learning is in the first couple of weeks of life. All right, when they're learning how to think, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you take your crested gecko, like we used to do in the old days, right? And you raise these two eggs. They don't fight, so you raise the two babies together for the first 3 months. Unfortunately, they're not fighting physically, but there is a mental fight there because one is going to be stressed from the other one, right? But what I say, I would even take that a step further. They, in those first 3 months that you're raising them together, they are learning how to think. Okay. Crested geckos already, they are born thinking everything is going to eat them. So when you raise them in a large exposed enclosure with another animal, they are that instinct is being confirmed, right? So they are now learning how to think in a fearful manner, thinking everything is going to get me. The way that I raise them, they come out of the egg, right away they go into their own enclosure. It's tight, it's small, it's secure. They feel safe, so they're already calm. They're not in a nervous state of mind. Then, because they're small and because I'm using paper products, I have to clean them every other day. So on top of that, they are getting touched and handled every other day. Between those things, they don't, I believe that they don't learn to think them in a stressful manner. Yes. They learn to think differently. They learn to think much more confidently.
Well, we have not had this conversation before, and I have always said, one of the biggest reasons why I stick with just gargoyles is gargoyles in general, in my opinion, now there's some flighty ones, are calmer.
Oh, wait.
Gargoyles are, you know what I mean? But everybody will agree you keep gargoyle babies away from each other. You do not raise gargoyle. Very few people have I ever heard raise their gargoyle babies in the same enclosure.
No,
right? You're going to end up with no, not at all. You're going to end up with a missing toe or a tail or, worse. Because they are cannibalistic at that point. So I wonder if that attributes, keeping them separate, makes a huge deal with all of them, right? And but we're just doing it with gargoyles.
No,
we aren't doing it with cresteds.
I think
because every crest I've ever gotten is a nut job.
Okay, so now going back on this teaching thing, all right?
Yeah,
I teach my dogs how to think. I teach my child how to think. I teach my geckos how to think. It goes. This is exactly why you can come see me at an expo, and I have 7 adults out on the table, gargoyles, cresteds, chihuahua, and I don't have to watch them. I don't worry about them leaving the table. I don't worry about them running away. I don't worry about them getting scared because, whatever. I don't worry about them stressing out. Why? Because I've taught them how to think and how to. I've given them the experience. They learn through experience, is what it comes down to. I've given them the experience to understand and learn that all of these things that I just mentioned are not things to be afraid of, and they're not.
Right. And like you said, you're conditioning them over time in small increments. So you start with,
no, actually, it's not security. Small increments.
Well, not always, but at first you don't probably even realize you're doing it. But you just handling them, having a positive experience each time you're swapping out the paper towel, that's a step to getting them to be able to be handled by a stranger at an expo, which is the big experience, right? Yes. And so, I used to be a dog trainer, and a lot of the big showy things that you do with your animals are just small chained behaviors that get trained over a longer period of time and reinforced in a positive way. And so I was wondering, like your animals are always impressive. I wonder if it was partly age, right? Because you got Potato out there who's sitting there, and I'm just like, he's giving me a thumbs up, like whatever that is. But I don't know if she's just, older and more chill, but then I see, you got your Chewy out there. You've got all these animals that if it was anybody else's collection would be just on the floor running, looking to hide. So do you keep them out, like when you're cleaning your enclosures or you're just in your gecko room? Do you ever just keep them out like that, or do you just train them at the show?
Um, I don't. No, I don't. No, I don't do what I
Not
do at the show
purposely.
at home. No,
Okay.
but do I work? And I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but I mean, because I've got thousands of animals. But do I work on every
Sure.
animal as I'm cleaning? Yes. All right. So one of the things that I disagree with that you find online a lot, it has to do directly with this and taming your animal, right, and getting it to trust you. Almost
Yeah.
every single care sheet or every piece of information on the internet will tell you when you first get it, don't touch it. Once it's acclimated, take it out for 5 minutes at a time, slowly and gradually until you. I don't subscribe to that at all. In fact, that's another set of instructions that kind of gives me a headache because
Fair enough.
I think people are not understanding what the point. People are so afraid of stressing the animal out that they're not
Mm-hmm.
actually understanding what the point of trying to earn the animal's trust means and what you have to go through. These animals are
Yeah.
very aware, they're very intelligent, and they learn through experience. All right. So if, like, per se, I don't like taking it out for 5 minutes and putting it away. You can't earn trust in 5 minutes. If the animal doesn't trust you and it's trying to run away and it's scared, it's doing that to try to get away from you. If you then go and
Right.
put that animal into the enclosure, from
They win.
that animal's point of view, running away
Mm-hmm.
worked. It got what
Yep.
it wanted, right? So now, if you only handle it for 5 minutes a time for the first 2 weeks, what you are doing is you are teaching that animal not to trust you, right? For the first two
Yeah.
weeks, every time you take it out, it doesn't ever get past that fear point, right? So
Right.
now, every time it gets stressed, it's going to go back into that state of mind because that is what worked for it the first time. So what
Yeah.
I advise instead is let the animal acclimate, right? Make sure that it's settled in, it's eating, it's doing all that kind of stuff before you handle it. But when you do take it out and handle it, the very first time, right? Don't put a time limit on it. You pay attention to the
Mm-hmm.
animal's body language. If that animal is in a nervous or apprehensive or unsure state of mind, do not put the animal away. Do
Mm-hmm.
not, what I call, do not do any forced interaction at that point, right? So
Mm-hmm.
don't look at it. Don't eyeball it because if that animal's scared, it's watching your face and it's watching your eyes. And if you're staring at it, you're telling that animal that you are coming to get it, whether you realize it or not, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
don't talk to it. Don't try to pet it. As long as it's in that nervous state of mind, you just hold on to it. Keep it in contact with you, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
longer it's in contact with you and nothing happens, it will start to calm down. And once it starts to calm down, then you start to do the forced interaction, touching it, talking to it, looking at it. If it gets nervous, you pull away, right? And you go back
Mm-hmm.
to, don't put it down, don't lose
Mm-hmm.
contact, but don't force yourself on it. And what you'll find is they learn really, really quick, especially if that
Mm-hmm.
interaction is positive.
But like you said, they learn really quick. So if it's not positive, they also learn really quick. And so
100%.
I've got one of my favorite animals, my boy Komodo. He's gorgeous. He also is probably one of my more flighty geckos for a gargoyle. So with me, he's totally fine. I can handle him, not a big deal. I don't give him to my kids because he's just a little bit more spooked.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to get my kids in here more when I'm handling him so that he gets more conditioned to that. And the other day I had a group of people who, came to visit. They want to see my gecko room, and I'm not going to say no because I'm a gecko geek. And so I pull them out and they're all oohing and eyeing. And, my son screamed. He's only, 3 years old is what they do, toddlers. And the gecko jumps off my hand onto the floor
Mm-hmm.
and it starts bolting. And I'm like, you know what? I don't have time for this. I got to get back to the grill. And very first time I grab the gecko, it's wiggling. I know better. If a gecko is wiggling like that, I should have just let it go, got it back, jumping into my hands, and then just walked it and got it calmed down again. I grabbed it a little bit too tight, turns around. First time I got a bite ever, right? And just tags me, and my thumb starts bleeding. Doesn't hurt, just a little blood. And I'm thinking the trainer in me, I go, all right, I'm an idiot. I screwed up. This isn't the animal's fault, right?
Mm-hmm.
I need to go back in that cage now.
Yes.
I need to go and get that animal now, handle it so that I'm nowhere near fearful or jumping the next time I handle my gecko, because they're going to read my body language.
100%.
And two, I don't want that animal to fear me.
Right.
And so I made the mistake. I need to go in there and apologize and not rough handle the gecko, but just let it get used to it. Like you said, when it's stressed, let it learn from me that was a mistake. Sorry, but it won't happen again. And so it worked. And now I can go in there right now, go grab them and show them to you if you want, you know? So makes a difference. And I think people, once they get spooked, they just want to run away, right? Because then they're fearful of the gecko. And even if the gecko can't do any damage, again, they're reading your eyes, your body language, your hand shaking like that when you're holding it, you know?
Yes. Yep.
Makes a difference.
Yeah. And I forgot where I was going to go with that. I lost my train
sorry.
of thought.
I talk too much sometimes.
No. It's absolutely important to go back in for a bite. I know it's counterintuitive, but the best thing you can do is not react. You know, because if you react, then the animal is getting the reaction it's looking for. So that behavior worked. If the behavior works, they tend to do it again. I had gotten a crested gecko from Kelly like 2 seasons ago. And, you know, I know where it's coming from. I don't have to quarantine it from Kelly.
Right.
So I bring it home and I throw it, you know, I had it planned for a breeding group and I throw him in the group. And I go back to feed him, I think like 2 days later. And as soon as I walk over to the tub, this male is freaking out. I mean, he is literally doing laps in the enclosure, and he is hitting everything in that enclosure. Bang! I mean, you can hear it. He's going nuts. And I open the top, and he comes flying out like he's got bottle rockets strapped to his back. And you know, of course, I got to grab a hold of him. You know, and now I'm restraining him, and now he's even more pissed off at me and more scared of me. And so we go through this, you know, for 4 or 5 feedings. And I see that every time it's getting worse and it's getting worse. And so finally we get to a point where I can't do this because now it's taken me 3 times longer to clean this one enclosure because of this one animal. And, you know, I've got hundreds of them to do. So the next time I take him out and feed him, he's bouncing around. I open up the cage. I grab a hold of him. And again, since you've seen me at the show, I always have one of the geckos on my back. All right. So that's a really good way to start out. Right. So where you have contact, but there's no force contact. Right. So I take this male and I throw him on my back and I go back, I put the cage back up and I go back to work. Now, for the first 10 minutes, he doesn't stay on my back. Right. Every second he's turning and jumping off, and I just very calmly, again, no quick movements, no eye contact, just very gently pick him up and put him back on my back and go back to work. Within 5 minutes, he's staying on my back. Right now, he's staying back there. He don't want to have contact or nothing like that, but he's staying on me. So the next time we feed, I go directly to that cage, pull him out, put him on my back, and go to work. Second time, that's it. That's all it took. Now, we weren't best friends, right? But no longer does he do laps on the cage and bang on everything. And now what he does a lot of times is when I pull the cage down, I open the top, he'll come running up, but he'll hang out on the top and he'll just look at me. I can reach out, I can touch him, I can hold him. You know, they learn.
You built that trust.
Yeah, you just have to take a little bit of time and teach them. And understand, too, that, you know, especially an animal that's a little more high-strung and a little more nervous, right? The thing that I hear most is people are afraid of stressing them out. You have to go through a little bit of stress in order to learn, right? I mean, that's a fact. They're going to have to. One of the things I'd like to get across to people is that with the New Caledonian, with the exception of cresteds, the New Caledonian geckos don't have a tendency to stress in the way that I think a lot of other reptiles do. You know, if we're talking like leaf-tail geckos or something like that, you know, they need specific tactile sensations, right? Specific visual sensations. The New Caledonian geckos, they don't need any of that, and especially gargoyles. they're the
Do you
apex
think
predator.
because the ones we keep are exactly, they're the apex predator?
They're the top of the food
There's
chain.
no nervous lion.
No.
Unless it sees another lion or smells another lion. Lions walk around like they don't give a shit. They'll lay down anywhere.
Yes.
And so and you see a big strong guy walking around with a giant machete. Like they're not worried about things, right? It's the weaker things. It's the prey items that and I think, like you said, the crested geckos are more prey. In my opinion.
People ask me at the shows, what's the biggest difference between the two? The easiest explanation: crested geckos look at the world as what's going to eat me. Gargoyles look at the world as what am I going to eat?
Yep. And I like one better than the other. You guys guess which one it is.
I'm a little biased, of course.
There you go. That's why we get along. All right. So one other thing I wanted to actually bring up is new traits. So I'm wondering, again, you don't have to give me any inside baseball if you don't want to on this, but I picked up a gecko from someone wink, wink, that there might be, depending on what genetics may be in this gecko, I'm wondering if there's any new information on hypo, any new information on, anything else that's kind of, leering around in the hobby that you've seen, that you could share with us, because I feel like we're so ready for a morph, but there's just not a lot of information. I know clown was mentioned once. I don't think anybody's ever seen a melanistic gargoyle, but there is a new melanistic chewy that people are claiming. Is there any morphs that you could talk about or shed some light on that maybe there's some misinformation or get us all excited about?
Well, I don't want to say melanistic per se, because melanistic would imply that it's a recessive
all
trait,
black.
I think.
Yeah.
I have a line of black gargoyles that are melanistic, right, through breeding, not because it's a genetic trait. Then we have the white animals, whether they're amel or hypo. I'm not sure yet. I lean more toward the amel side myself, but.
So what would that mean genetically for those? Would you think that that's a recessive thing, or like? I know we're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I've made a couple of them myself. Kelly has made a couple of them. But yeah, in my case, unfortunately, I don't know who made them.
Well, that's the fun thing with the gecko I have is it's not whatever that genetic is, it's not a visual, and so I just know that its siblings, I was told, were visuals, so I'm hoping it's recessive. That way. I'm hoping it's a het.
Here's for the white animals, because it's hard to say until we prove it, right? So you have different types of albino and leopard geckos, three different albinos. Okay, so what's to say that we don't have the same display in two different lines, but they're caused by something different, right? So we don't even know if that's the case yet. I kind of steer away from the recessive side of it at this point, largely because these white animals, to be quite honest, it is not something that's new.
Interesting.
The very first white animal I had 15 years ago. I didn't understand what it was at the time because we knew that the gargoyles had tons and tons of variability, right? So, and they fire up and they fire down. A lot of them look white when they're fired down. So, and some of them stay fired down most of their lives. Some of them stay fired up most of their lives. Those are genetic things too. So the very first animal is, I don't know if you had on the message, the email that you sent me, you used one of my pictures, the white one and the red one together.
Yes.
So that male was the very first one that I personally had, and that was 15 years ago.
Very cool. I'll post a picture of it right here.
And I didn't realize, I tried to reproduce it. I was never able to reproduce it. When it hatched, It hatched out of a group that I had already bred for several years. It came out of the egg. It was absolutely different from the very moment it came out of the egg. That in that picture, as white as it is, that's fired up. I mean, it didn't have black pattern or nothing like that. So now fast forward to what we have now, where we have quite a few of them out. So the reason I don't think it's recessive, all right, so not only mine, but there are accounts of others even before mine. All right, so if the trait has been around that long and it's still popping up randomly, I think the odds of it being a recessive trait and being undiscovered thus far is not high.
Okay.
But we also have to take into consideration the polymorphism in these animals, right? So the black eyes, right? The phantom eyes.
Yeah.
A lot of people look for the phantom eyes. The problem with that is they don't hatch that way. They grow out that way. There are some people that are breeding them and they sell phantom-eyed animals that don't actually have it yet, and they may or may not turn. And so the question comes up: how do you know? And how widespread is it? And you don't know. You don't know until the animal's older. But in trying to understand it, again, I have to use analogies. But the best way that I could describe it was the way that I think it's happening. Because of polymorphism, I think all the traits that we see in the gargoyles are probably existing in almost all of the gargoyles. All right. It's just whether or not they come up. So an analogy would be like a set of dice or 3 dice, right? You've got 3 dice. All of those dice contain the numbers 1 through 6. I don't care how many times you roll them. Every one of those dice has the numbers 1 through 6, right? But phantom eyes require all 3 dices have 6s. So how many times do you have to roll before you get 3 6s? But the genetics are always there. Every single roll, the genetics are there, right? So essentially, I think that's the way the genetics are working for these guys, right? So you have all these genetics are probably set pretty much in every single animal. It's just
but if you take, just to run with that analogy, if you were to take 2 animals with visual phantom eyes, have you ever taken 2 phantom eyed animals, bred them together, and do they produce, even if it takes 3 years for them to develop, what percentage, are the 2 dice, because you've got them where the parents both have those 3 6s, right? And you're throwing those together, do you have a higher chance of getting another 3 6? I think because you're starting with more 6s.
I think
does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it again. I think it increases your odds, but it's not. It's not a definite. Again, right? Because you're talking big numbers. So, and 3 or 4, especially in the beginning, right? In the very beginning, they didn't show up till 5 years or plus. So it's very difficult to keep every baby from a breeding for 5+ years. It's just,
it's near impossible.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Now with the couple lines that Kelly and I have, we're seeing them as early as a year. So are they still 100%? No, not at all. Yeah. But is the percentage of babies that we're getting, is it growing every season? It is, absolutely. So could there be a day when we can control it and maybe, just like everything, red stripes didn't come out. In the beginning, you bred 2 red stripes. It would take you 50 babies before you got another red stripe.
Wow.
So
that puts it in perspective right there.
Yeah. Yeah, this is why some of these things were so expensive in the beginning. People don't understand, right? I mean, you could breed 2 high-end animals. They may not give you what you're asking for.
Which, I think that's where, investing in certain animals, it's hard because, like you said, you're not guaranteed nice babies out of your nicest animals. Sometimes the animals that are just okay breed the best animals. But I think because this has been worked on for X amount of years, especially if there's certain lineages like your group 3. I mean, I've seen so many killer animals that I look back at their lineage and it's like, oh, well, it's part of RhacHouse group 3. Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense, right? And it's not a guarantee.
You know what?
But it is good.
What it is more, right? So in all honesty, there are animals out there that are nicer than some of my group threes. I won't even say that it's not. What is special about that group, in my opinion, is the longevity at which those traits have been applied to it. So, you take one of my group threes, you might go find an animal that is just as nice or maybe nicer from somebody else. But what if that animal's a one-off, right? That animal could have come from two animals that look nothing like that. So the difference is not the way the animal looks, but it's in the genetics, right? My animal might not look as nice, but if you're looking for 6 stripes, my animal's probably going to give you a greater percentage of them than an animal that's a one-off.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which,
because I feel like you said, it's stacking generations of, and not that we can ever have 100% guarantee, but you're stacking the odds in your favor.
No, I think if we start to see 100%, then we better probably start questioning some genetics, because then I think, if polymorphism is how they've evolved and we start to erase that, then I think, we may start seeing some problems, genetic problems.
Then we go back to the F1s.
Yeah.
Fair enough. No, that's awesome. Okay.
There's still some around. There's still some kicking.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, there's still some absolute, cool wild caught ones. Like I said, I've got the one F1 girl that I'm breeding just to kind of see what the difference in the babies are, and what she can produce. Cause she's got some decent color for being an F1. She's a blotch. But we'll see. It's fun to play with the genetics. So I also want to get your take, because you go to a lot of shows and you have one of the biggest gargoyle displays. You also breed other new cow species and sell other new cow species. One thing that gets, kicked around a lot, and we don't have to focus on this too long, but the market right now, you've been around long enough to see ebbs and flows where most people have only seen, the spike. They've only been around for less than 5-6 years. What advice can you give people? Where do you see the market now? And what do people need to really put in perspective when it comes to moving your geckos, or, because we can't keep everything.
Yeah. I mean, with the economy the way it is, that's a tough answer, because at the end of the day, all of our geckos are $2 geckos. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
They're nobody needs a gecko. So our geckos really are only worth, what the market is paying. Like you said, though, there's ups and downs, right? This is not the first downward slide I've seen. It's probably not going to be the last.
No.
If you got into this and you are into it just for the money, then this is something that's probably going to hurt you. But if you're in it more for the love, and you're in it for any other reasons other than just money, then what you do is you just ride it out, and it will, just like everything that goes up comes down, everything that comes down goes up again. Things will come back. The next new morph, we were going back a little bit on the morphs. I don't know if you've seen it in Europe. There's what looks like translucent dragons. I mean, gargoyles.
Gargoyles.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like that? Like, sort of like it almost looks like it's messing with the blotch pattern, where some are like really dark and some are light. And
well, in the dragons. All right, when I was doing Sandfire. That's when the translucent dragons first showed up. Was at the time that I was out there. In the dragons, what I noticed right off the bat, the translucent, what it was it was the white, right? So if the animals have colors, your white is usually your base color, and then all the other colors are kind of layered on top of that. So the dragons were missing white, and that was the unique thing about them. That trait showed up in Periodor pictus. Same thing. It's missing the white. They're translucent. They generally have solid black eyes. As far as I can tell, it's the same thing in the gargoyles. Sure looks like it to me.
Actually, fun fact for you, and anybody watching this, you can go back. I think I still have it up. when I first got onto YouTube, I was like, I mean, this wasn't that long ago. It was only, what, a year and a half ago. I had a guy reach out to me saying, hey, I liked your first few videos. Here's some pictures I want to show you. What do you think? And I kind of rushed through the video. And I actually have it labeled as like new morph, right? And they're like, we don't know much about it yet. Like, you shouldn't have released it that quickly. I'm like, sorry, I thought you gave me the pictures, you gave me the information. I was just putting it out there. I'm brand new to this. And they weren't mad. But I actually took it down for a little bit. I reposted it probably a few months ago. But if you go back just for fun, go look at those pictures. And it's exactly what you're explaining. It's what we're seeing. But it was actually, I think, in Korea. So it might be in Korea too.
Yeah, I think,
and Italy, and
I think I've seen it pop up in a couple different locations. Yeah.
Yeah. So I honestly think they look a little ugly. So that's one thing with morphs. It's like, I know everybody is obsessed with certain, genetic morphs. But at the end of the day, like you said, this isn't a money thing for me. It really isn't. I'm having fun with it. I love having my kids watch my geckos hatch and interact with them. That makes it worth it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so morph chasing, as cool as it is, I just still like a red gecko. I know people are saying, well, we got to move on. No, a red super blotch. Man, the one I'm getting tomorrow, like I said, it's Christmas. It's going to be amazing. And that's exactly what I want.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, for me, my dream gecko would be
Yeah.
a bicolor orange and red super blotch with 90% coverage or more and over the head and face, and that would
That'd
be
be
a
awesome.
perfect gecko for me.
Yeah. And my girl Bimini, she's a bicolor. I would say she's borderline on super blotch, but she's producing nicely. Yeah, if her color would spread, but she also developed a yellow base, and I love that look where it's a yellow base and that bicolor. It's almost like, when you're a little kid and you draw fire and you have the 3 different distinct colors.
Yeah,
That's what she is, and I love that look.
yeah, that's cool.
So,
And that's not something you don't see very many animals that will display 3 colors like that, especially in an adult. That at least I haven't seen very many like that.
No, very few. Her sister didn't. Her sister went straight red. And maybe she'll go straight red. She's only, 3.5 years. This is her first year breeding. And, we'll see. Time will tell, because these guys do change even into later adulthood. Just because at 2 years they look a certain way does not mean they're going to look that way exactly at 10 years is what I've been told.
No, they continue to change throughout their life. In fact, it's one of the aspects to the phantom eyes, I think, is why it was age related in the older days. Once you've kept quite a few animals, over 5, 6, 7 years, you'll start to see that the vast majority of them do produce more melanin as they get older, right? They get darker. And this is, I think, that's all the eyes are. It's just more melanin, and it's displayed in the eyes.
So cool. Well, Paul, I've learned so much. This did not disappoint. Cool. I really appreciate it. So we could keep going. I definitely will have to bring you back on to pick your brain another time. I just got to come up with a few more questions before I have you back. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
If people don't know where to find you, where can they find you? What's your favorite social medias to go to? And then what shows are you going to be doing next?
Facebook. I'm on Facebook most. So you can find me on Morph Market. I'm busy taking care of the animals, so I'm not online a ton. Best way is if you want to talk to me, just get a hold of me. If you're looking for animals, get a hold of me. Tell me what you're looking for, and we can go from there. I got a lot of stuff that never gets posted.
Yeah, you definitely got some hidden gems going. So maybe we'll talk after this.
Cool.
But thank you again so much for coming on, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, have a good one.
Night.
Hey, if you've enjoyed this video and want to encourage me to make more Gargoyle Gecko content, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, share this with a friend, and maybe check out one of the videos right over there. I'll see you next time on Gecko Cove.